Okay, as John said, your mind starts to boggle when you think too much about statistics, and my particular interest as part of the group has always been to find the story of the men. Who were these people? Who were these 350 odd people in the present borough of Haringey? What motivated them? What can we find out about them? Now, Joanne is going to tell you a little bit more about how we came to find out about them, because our resources are limited, and one always wishes one had more, which is why I was so excited to see Cyril's photo this morning, because somebody might be on there. Now, I'm going to talk only about two men. And when you're faced with the possibility of having to find two men to talk about out of 350 odd, it's difficult. So basically it was what we had most information on. And the two men I've chosen are Isaac Goss, whose motivation was religious. I'll come back to more detail about him in a minute. And Walter Hohenroth, whose motivation was that he was a socialist. These two men do have something in common, and that's both that they were both from immigrant families. Now, that's not necessarily typical of the area, but there were quite a lot of COs who were of parents or grandparents who had moved from somewhere else to this country. So if we look at Isaac Goss, original name Gostomski, was the son of immigrant parents, Moses and Susan. They must have arrived in the country in the early 1870s, as far as we know. I can't find that they were here before that. They certainly weren't here on the 1871 census. They were of Russian-Polish extraction. Now, that on the census usually means they came from the Pale of Settlement, and therefore it is likely that they were a Jewish family. And if you look at the names of the children, that adds to that probability. Moses himself was a tailor. Now, I know not all tailors are Jewish, but it is another indicator that they were a Jewish family. Isaac himself became a tailor. So that's what I've deduced from that. Now, we have had the good fortune to meet up with Philippa Goss, who is the granddaughter of Isaac. So we have a photo, and on the left there you can see Isaac, who was born in 1880 in Leicester, as it says there, but you can see the sort of man he was. That is taken probably way after the First World War, in his middle years. And on the right I discovered that he'd been buried in Jordan's Cemetery, Beaconsfield, which is a Society of Friends burial ground, and so I don't know which one he is, but I've got a photograph of him, of that cemetery there as well, to add to information about him, to add to our picture of him. He was married with 4 children, but we know nothing more about who his wife was or who the 4 children were. He owned a tailoring business. His brother Joseph, who I'll mention in a moment, worked alongside him in the tailoring business, and their chief job at the time of the conscription coming in was to make uniforms for volunteers for the Friends of War Victim Relief Committee. I hadn't until that time known that they wore uniforms, but they did, and he made them. Now, he was a very prominent citizen, local citizen. He did all kinds of things. He ran a local Sunday school. By the way, I should have said, by 1911 he had joined officially the Quakers. He'd been a Quaker attender up until then, but he became a full member in 1911. He ran a local Sunday school, as I've said. He ran local boys' clubs, and local I mean in Stroud Green, which is part of Hornsey, where he lived. He ran summer camps, and he was also the honorary secretary of a London County Council school care committee. So you can picture from that sort of list the kind of person he was, so well known. He was also an absolutist, and he claimed absolute exemption from Hornsey Tribunal. They didn't give it to him. He was later given conditional exemption to do work of national importance, which he turned down. He didn't just sort of sit there because he wrote to Haringey Tribunal and asked them if they knew what terrible conditions they were subjecting people to who they refused exemption for. And he cited the example of five, getting confused now, 5 brothers who lived in the same road as he did. They're called the Walkers. Now, had we more time, I would tell you more about these 5 Walker brothers because they are most interesting. But they lived in the same road as he did, and 3 of them were taken to Shoreham Barracks, and they were hideously treated. They were almost, well, tortured really is the word, and questions in the house were asked about their torture and so on. So Isaac, I was going to call him Oscar, Isaac wrote to the Haringey Tribunal and asked them if they knew what happened to people that they were denying exemption to. He also had gone down to Shoreham and met with senior officers there about the abuse that the Walker brothers were receiving. So he wasn't a sort of quiet, retiring, shy bloke. So you'll certainly be a bit surprised then what happened next. He was not doing anything. He was an absentee officially in the government's eyes. So he was arrested in 1917 and taken to Mill Hill Barracks. Now you would expect that he would then be either sent away to some unit of the army and refuse to do anything and court-martialed and put in prison. That's the normal path that you would expect. But no, somehow he came home. And somehow he spent the rest of the war at home, according to both the records and his granddaughter. Now, it looks like he was forgotten about, but I think rather he was forgotten about because he was obviously a troublemaker and they decided to leave him be. So that's Isaac. That's his brother Joseph. There isn't time to talk about him today. But he, like Isaac, was an absolutist, went through the same track with the tribunals, but turned down work of national importance, turned down Home Office scheme, but he then spent the rest of the war in prison in Wandsworth. So completely different things happened to 2 brothers with the same motivations. Joseph also became a Quaker, but much later, after the war.